Here is something that almost no one says directly to the man who has withdrawn. Not that his withdrawal was wrong. Not that the people he removed didn't deserve to be removed, or that the distance he created wasn't, at some level, necessary. But this. The clarity you feel in the silence is not the same thing as knowing yourself. There is a specific kind of man this video is for. He has, over months or years, systematically reduced the number of people he allows close. Not through conflict, usually. Not through the kind of dramatic rupture that at least gives both parties something to understand. Through a quieter process. Invitations declined until they stopped coming. Messages answered with less and less of himself until the conversation found its own natural end. Friendships allowed to go dark the way certain rooms go dark when no one bothers to turn the lights back on. And from the inside, this did not feel like loss. It felt like relief. He has a version of the story that explains it. The people he removed were draining. They were not operating at his level. The social world he withdrew from was performative, organized around a currency of interaction he had no interest in trading. He was protecting his energy. He was finally, after years of extending himself to people who could not meet him, learning discernment. These explanations are not entirely false, but underneath them, underneath the philosophy, underneath the relief, underneath the increasingly fluent account of why this version of his life is the right one, there is something that the silence has not resolved. He still doesn't fully trust his own judgment about people. That is the wound this script is actually about, not the withdrawal itself. What the withdrawal is protecting him from finding out. The withdrawal did not begin as a philosophy. It began as a conclusion drawn from accumulated evidence. At some point, usually not a single moment, but the weight of many moments arriving at once, the relational world stopped feeling like a place of possible nourishment and began to feel like a system that extracted what he had without particular interest in who he actually was. He had extended himself genuinely, and it hadn't held. He had trusted, and the trust had been misread or ignored or quietly instrumentalized. He had been present, sometimes at significant personal cost, and that presence had been received as available infrastructure rather than as a chosen act. The conclusion his nervous system arrived at was precise and felt like insight. I have been wrong about people, repeatedly. And the cost of being wrong is too high to keep paying. This is where most analyses of the withdrawal pattern stop, at the pain that produced it. But Jung would press further, and his pressure matters, because the question is not whether the pain was real. It was. The question is what the conclusion drawn from the pain actually solved. The man who cuts everyone off believes, at some level he may not have examined directly, that the withdrawal has solved the problem of his relational misjudgment. If he is not close to people, he cannot be wrong about them. If he does not extend trust, it cannot be misplaced. The distance is not only protection from others, it is protection from his own capacity to see people inaccurately, to believe someone is safe when they are not, to invest in a version of a relationship that the other person was never actually offering. What he does not yet see is this: the withdrawal has not refined his relational judgment. It has simply suspended the conditions under which that judgment would be tested. He is not better at reading people than he was before. He has removed the context in which reading people occurs, and a faculty that is never used does not improve. It atrophies. The very capacity he needs to accurately perceive another person, to extend appropriate trust, to know the difference between genuine connection and its performance, has been in a kind of storage, untested, for however long the withdrawal has lasted. Jung would call this a critical distinction. The man believes he is protecting a self that has been clarified by isolation. What he is actually protecting is a self that has never been tested by genuine encounter, since the wound that produced the withdrawal. Those are not the same thing. and the difference between them is the entire territory of what this video is actually about. Jung was specific about the relationship between the self and the other in the individuation process, and his specificity is not optional here. Individuation. The central psychological task Jung identified for the second half of human life is the process of becoming who you actually are, not who you were trained to be. It requires genuine interiority. It requires the development of what Jung called internal authority, the capacity to locate your values and your sense of self from within, rather than drawing them continuously from social confirmation. This is real. The need the man felt to stop performing, to stop being defined entirely by what others required of him, to create enough interior space to locate something genuine. That need was not wrong, but Jung was equally explicit about what the individuation process cannot accomplish in isolation. And this is where the contemporary discourse around cutting people off goes catastrophically silent. The shadow, the unconscious accumulation of everything a man has suppressed, denied, or failed to integrate in the construction of his acceptable self, does not become visible in solitude. It becomes visible in relationship, specifically through a mechanism Jung called projection. Projection is not a metaphor. It is a precise description of how the psyche distributes unacceptable material. What we cannot tolerate in ourselves, we locate unconsciously in the people around us. What has been exiled from the interior, the rage that was never permitted its expression, the vulnerability that was armored over, the need that was declared weakness, the capacity for misjudgment that is too threatening to own directly. These do not disappear when we go into the interior. They go looking for faces to wear. This is why the extended withdrawal produces something the man was not expecting. The people are gone, but the irritations remain. The specific kinds of dynamics that destabilized him before, the feeling of being consumed, of being misread, of watching someone he trusted reveal themselves to be less than he believed. These patterns do not resolve in the silence. They continue to generate themselves internally with new objects when external ones are absent. The man who cut everyone off finds, if he is honest, that his internal life in isolation is not notably more peaceful or more generous than his relational life was. It is simply quieter. And in that quiet, the same conclusions keep forming, about the same kinds of imagined scenarios with an increasing certainty that has no external friction to correct it. This is the precise psychological cost of removing the relational field. And it is the one the withdrawal strategy never accounts for. The ego, the conscious organizing center of identity, requires the friction of genuine encounter to remain accurate. Not because the other is always right, but because the ego, left entirely to its own architecture, is a self-confirming system. It becomes increasingly skilled at finding evidence for what it already believes, at constructing narratives about people and situations that are never complicated by the reality of those people's actual presence. The relational field, with all its difficulty and its disappointment, was providing a corrective function. The isolation has not eliminated what needed correcting. It has eliminated the only context in which correction was possible. The shadow does not dissolve when its projection carriers are removed. It waits. And the man who remains in isolation long enough discovers, usually not all at once, usually as a slow and slightly disorienting realization, that the internal clarity he was promised by the withdrawal has a ceiling. That past that ceiling, the silence is not deepening him. It is sealing him. What lives beyond that ceiling is the work that can only be done in contact. There is a specific moment many men in this pattern can locate if they are willing to look at it honestly. It is not the moment of initial withdrawal. It is what arrives after the relief has run its length, after the quiet has had enough time to reveal its actual texture. The man expected to find himself in the silence. What he finds instead is a version of himself that is increasingly difficult to verify. This requires precision, because it is the part of the experience that is almost never named. When a man is in sustained relationship, in the imperfect, sometimes frustrating, friction-generating encounter with another person who has their own reality, he receives constant, low-level information about who he is, not because other people's perceptions of him are accurate. They often are not. But because the gap between how he perceives himself and how he lands in the world of another person is information. The resistance is information. The moments of unexpected recognition are information. Even the misunderstandings are information, because a man who is misunderstood in a consistent way across multiple relationships is being shown something about how he presents that his internal self-image cannot access on its own. In isolation, this information stream goes dark. What replaces it is the ego's own account of itself, which is fluent and internally consistent and accountable to nothing outside its own architecture. The man develops an increasingly elaborate understanding of who he is, what he requires, what he is capable of, what went wrong in the relationships he severed, and none of it is ever tested by the complicating presence of another person's genuine reality. Nietzsche identified this failure of isolation with uncomfortable precision. He wrote about the man who mistakes the relief of removal for the strength of confrontation. The early period after withdrawal genuinely does feel like strength. The pressure has lifted, the noise is gone, the performing has stopped. What arrives in its place feels like authenticity, finally the real self, no longer distorted by other people's demands. But Nietzsche would recognize this feeling as the ego's response to the removal of all corrective friction, not as evidence of genuine self-knowledge. A man who has never been tested does not know what he is made of. He knows what he believes he is made of. These are different things, and the distance between them is exactly what genuine encounter would reveal. Viktor Frankl would add something to this from a different direction, meaning, not comfort, not clarity, but meaning cannot be generated inside the echo chamber of a fully withdrawn life. Frankl observed across decades of clinical work that the men who suffered most deeply were not those who had endured the most. They were those whose suffering had no witness, no context, no encounter with anything beyond themselves in which it could become legible. The man in isolation is not building meaning from his solitude. He is building a very coherent and very private account of why the world did not deserve him. And that account, however intellectually sophisticated, does not function as meaning. It functions as a reason to remain where he is. The question the silence is actually asking, the question underneath all the philosophy and the relief and the carefully maintained distance, is this: is the self you have been protecting in here capable of what you believe it is? And the answer to that question is not available in the silence. It is only available in contact. What becomes available after this recognition is not a reversal. This is the first thing to say clearly, because the man in withdrawal will resist what follows if he believes it is asking him to return to relationships that were genuinely consuming, or to people who were genuinely inadequate to what he needed. Some of those separations were accurate. Some of the people were, in the most honest assessment, incompatible with the version of himself that is actually trying to emerge. The withdrawal, at its origin, contained real psychological intelligence. What is being examined here is not whether to undo it. It is what to build next. The first movement of this work begins internally, and it begins with the most honest question a man in this pattern can ask himself. What specifically do I find consistently intolerable in other people? Not as a rhetorical question about the state of humanity. as a clinical one about the structure of his own projective landscape. Jung was precise about this. The content of what reliably disturbs us in others is not primarily information about them. It is information about what we have not yet integrated in ourselves. The man who cuts people off for being emotionally demanding may be carrying in his shadow a need for emotional attunement that he long ago decided was weakness. The man who severs people for being inconsistent may be carrying, without examining it, his own profound inconsistency between the self he projects and the self he privately knows. The man who ends relationships over what he reads as inauthenticity may be living at considerable distance from his own genuine motives. This is not a comfortable analysis. It is not meant to be. But following the irritation inward, asking what it is that I cannot tolerate in them, and then sitting with the discomfort of whether I recognize any of it in myself, is one of the most reliable paths into the shadow that is available without the full presence of another person. It begins the work of withdrawing projections before re-entering the field, which is what makes re-entry productive rather than simply repetitive. The second movement is a distinction the man in withdrawal usually cannot make, because the two things it separates currently feel identical to him from the inside. The distinction is between discernment and policy. Discernment is the capacity to evaluate a specific relationship at a specific point in time, using genuine self-knowledge about what you require to remain whole inside closeness, and to arrive at a conclusion that is particular, not general. This relationship at this depth is not compatible with my growth right now. That is discernment. It is flexible, case-specific, and made from a place of sufficient self-knowledge that it can distinguish between different kinds of relational difficulty. Policy is what happens when discernment has been too painful for too long. It replaces the case-by-case evaluation with a standing rule. Relational closeness is the problem. Proximity is the risk. People, as a category, are not to be trusted at depth. Policy feels like wisdom because it eliminates the need for the painful judgment that discernment requires. But it also eliminates the possibility of the outcome that the man, underneath all the protective architecture, still actually desires. The third movement is the one that carries the most weight, and it is the one the man in withdrawal is most likely to resist. It is the willingness to re-enter the relational field. Not completely, not without discernment, not by reinstating the exact relationships and dynamics that produce the withdrawal, but at sufficient depth that the shadow material becomes visible again, that the projection mechanism reactivates under conditions he can observe, that the self he has been protecting in isolation is finally tested by the complicating presence of another human being's genuine reality. This does not require a large relational world. It requires one relationship with enough depth and enough honest friction to function as a mirror. A therapeutic relationship holds this structure with particular reliability. It offers the encounter without the specific vulnerability of a friendship or intimacy that carries other stakes. A relationship with a person whose way of seeing the world genuinely differs from his, and who will not simply confirm his existing narrative about himself. The purpose is not reintegration into social life. The purpose is the specific discovery that cannot be made any other way. The discovery of what he is actually capable of when another person's reality is present. Because this is what the withdrawal, for all its genuine intelligence, has never allowed him to find out. Solitude can reveal who you are when no one is watching. Only encounter reveals who you are when someone is. And the man who has been in withdrawal long enough, who has built enough genuine interiority, who knows what he values and what he refuses and what he requires in order to remain himself, that man, when he finally re-enters the relational field, discovers something the withdrawal never made available. He discovers that the self he was protecting was real. Not because the silence confirmed it, because the encounter couldn't dissolve it. That is what he has been waiting to know. If you have recognized yourself in this, not with shame, but with the specific and slightly uncomfortable sensation of something accurately named, I want to close with something that carries no false resolution. The withdrawal made sense. The pain that produced it was real. And if you needed to go quiet for a while, if you needed to stop performing and stop extending yourself into relational structures that were taking more than they returned, that need was not wrong. But there is a question underneath the philosophy that the philosophy cannot answer for you. Not whether other people deserve your presence. Not whether the relational world is adequate to who you are. Those questions, framed that way, will always resolve in the direction of continued withdrawal, because they are being asked from inside a system designed to confirm what it already believes. The question is simpler and harder than those. Is the version of yourself that exists in this silence the whole of what you are? Or is there a dimension of who you are that only becomes real in contact with another person? Jung called the capacity for genuine encounter the fullest expression of individuation, not its opposite, not its enemy, not what you transcend when you have done enough interior work. The goal of becoming who you actually are is not a self that requires no one. It is a self that can be genuinely, stably, and undisappearingly present with someone. A self that does not lose its shape in proximity, that does not merge or perform or manage, but simply remains itself in contact without flinching. That self is not built in the absence of other people. It is discovered in their presence. The silence you have been living inside has done some of the work it was capable of doing. What it cannot do is the rest. And the rest is where you actually find out who you are.